Long before you could explain it, you felt that something had changed. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't obvious, it was just a quiet feeling that the connection wasn't the same anymore. The warmth that once came so naturally began to fade, almost like a room slowly losing its light. Now you're left wondering if you're imagining it. Maybe you're overthinking every little detail. Maybe he just needs time to himself. Maybe life has been overwhelming lately. Maybe if you're patient enough, the version of him who once made you feel deeply loved will eventually return. But here's what so many people never hear. When an avoidant starts emotionally checking out, it rarely happens all at once. There isn't usually a big fight or a dramatic goodbye. Instead, the connection slowly becomes harder to reach until one day you realize you've been trying to hold on to someone who's no longer fully present. The painful part is that you often can't even pinpoint when everything changed. So, before you convince yourself that nothing is wrong, before you send another message hoping it'll fix things, before you keep pouring your heart into someone who may have already started letting go, there's something important you need to understand. These 3 signs reveal far more than excuses ever will. Once you recognize them, it's almost impossible to ignore what's really happening. If you're ready to finally understand the emotional distance between you and an avoidant partner, type "ready" in the comments below. And stay with me until the end, because the 3rd sign is the one most people completely overlook, yet it's often the clearest indication of all. Before we dive into the signs, there's something essential you need to know about avoidant attachment. It rarely looks the way people expect. It's not always obvious, heartless, or intentionally cold. It's not always someone who never calls or never makes an effort. Sometimes it's the person who seemed incredible in the beginning, the one who showed up consistently, made you feel emotionally safe, and gave you hope that this relationship would finally be different. They were attentive, affectionate, and emotionally available in ways you hadn't experienced before. Naturally, you believed you had found someone who was truly ready for love. Then, almost without warning, things began to shift. At first, the changes were so small that they barely caught your attention. Maybe the conversations became shorter. Maybe the thoughtful messages became less frequent. Maybe the long nights talking together slowly turned into quick exchanges that ended before they really began. Instead of questioning it, you gave them the benefit of the doubt. You assumed work was stressful, life was busy, or they simply needed some breathing room. Without even realizing it, you started adjusting yourself around their distance. You asked for less, expected less, needed less. You convinced yourself that if you became easier to love, they wouldn't feel pressured to pull away. That's what often happens when you care deeply about someone who keeps creating space. You slowly reshape yourself in hopes that they'll stay. But that's the painful reality. No matter how much you shrink yourself, it never solves the problem. The reason lies much deeper than anything you're doing. Avoidant attachment is rooted in experiences that often began early in life. Many avoidant individuals learned that depending on others eventually led to disappointment, rejection, or emotional pain. Somewhere along the way, vulnerability stopped feeling safe. Instead of seeing closeness as comfort, their nervous system learned to see it as risk. To protect themselves, they built emotional walls, not because they wanted to hurt anyone, but because allowing someone too close felt overwhelming on a subconscious level. In the beginning, though, you probably felt like those walls didn't exist. That's because early relationships often create what's sometimes called the fantasy stage. During this period, everything still feels exciting, uncertain, and emotionally manageable for an avoidant. The relationship hasn't yet reached the level of intimacy that activates their deepest fears, so they can appear incredibly open, loving, and connected. The difficulty begins when the relationship starts becoming emotionally significant. Once the bond deepens, once the future feels more real, and once your importance in their life grows, their internal alarm system often begins reacting. Instead of leaning closer, they instinctively create distance to protect themselves. That doesn't necessarily mean their early affection wasn't genuine. It usually was. The problem is that maintaining that same level of emotional closeness becomes extremely difficult because their nervous system associates deep intimacy with losing their independence or becoming emotionally trapped. So they create space as a way to feel safe again. The question isn't whether they sometimes pull away. Most avoidants do. The real question is whether they're still willing to work through that discomfort because they value the relationship, or whether they've quietly reached a point where they've emotionally stepped away without saying it out loud. That's the difference we're exploring today. There's a huge difference between someone who is struggling with intimacy but still wants to build a future with you, and someone who has already disconnected emotionally while simply delaying the conversation. The second situation is much harder to recognize because it doesn't come with obvious warning signs. It unfolds quietly. On the surface, it can look almost identical to ordinary avoidant behavior. That's why so many people continue waiting, hoping, and carrying the emotional weight of the relationship alone, while the other person has already started leaving emotionally. The 3 signs we're about to cover will help you tell the difference between temporary emotional withdrawal and a genuine emotional exit. Once you truly understand these patterns, not just in theory but in your own experience, you'll stop questioning your instincts and start trusting what you've been feeling all along. Let's begin with the first sign, something I call the disappearance of repair. Every healthy relationship experiences moments of conflict and emotional disconnection. Conflict by itself doesn't mean a relationship is failing. In fact, it's one of the clearest signs that 2 real people are sharing their lives together. Whenever 2 people become emotionally close, misunderstandings are inevitable. There will be moments when feelings get hurt, words come out wrong, or one person unintentionally disappoints the other. Those moments are simply part of being human. What truly determines the health of a relationship isn't whether those difficult moments happen. It's what both people choose to do afterward. Healthy relationships are built on repair. They're built on the willingness to come back together after the distance, to reconnect, to acknowledge that something felt off, and to work through it instead of pretending it never happened. This is where avoidant partners can be difficult to understand because their version of repair doesn't always look familiar. Even when they genuinely care, they may not immediately want to sit down for a deep emotional conversation. Often they need time to calm their nervous system before they can reconnect. Instead of apologizing with long conversations, they may repair through actions. They might do something thoughtful, send a lighthearted message to ease the tension, crack a joke to break the awkwardness, or simply show up in a way that quietly says, "I'm still here." Their efforts may not match your communication style, but if they still value the relationship, you'll usually notice something pulling them back toward you. Even if they struggle to express it directly, they continue trying to maintain the connection. But when an avoidant has emotionally decided to leave, that movement slowly disappears. This isn't the same as someone who simply struggles with conflict. That difference is incredibly important. A person who finds conflict uncomfortable will often still reveal some desire to reconnect. Maybe they send you a funny video to soften the mood. Maybe they casually ask how your day was. Maybe they initiate contact without directly addressing the disagreement because that's the only way they know how to bridge the distance. Those efforts may be imperfect, but they still show that preserving the relationship matters. When an avoidant has emotionally checked out, those small attempts fade away completely. After an argument or emotional disconnect, there is only silence. Not the temporary silence of someone who needs time to regulate before returning, but an ongoing silence that stretches longer and longer until it becomes the normal pattern between you. You're always the one breaking the distance. If you stop reaching out, days, or even longer, pass without any effort from them to reconnect. And when you finally decide to contact them, maybe they answer, maybe they don't. But even if they do respond, it's as though the conflict never happened. There's no acknowledgement of the emotional distance, no curiosity about how you're feeling, and no effort to rebuild what was damaged. It can begin to feel as though fixing the relationship simply isn't important to them anymore. Take a moment and honestly think about your last few disagreements. Who was always the first person to reach back out? Who made the first effort to reconnect? Who tried to ease the tension, even in a small way? If the answer has consistently been you, don't ignore what that pattern may be telling you. Because chances are, earlier in the relationship, it wasn't always like that. There were moments when he reached out first. Maybe it wasn't graceful. Maybe it wasn't emotionally perfect. but something inside him still motivated him to close the distance between you. Now that motivation seems gone. The difficult part is that you've become so focused on carrying the relationship that you may not have noticed you've been carrying it alone. The disappearance of repair isn't simply about who sends the first message. It's about who still cares enough to make sure the relationship survives. And when an avoidant has emotionally stepped away, that desire to restore the connection often disappears with them. Now let's move to the second sign. This one is especially easy to misunderstand because at first glance, it can actually seem like something positive. You might tell yourself he's becoming more independent. Maybe he's finally building a balanced life outside the relationship. Maybe he's developing new interests and friendships, and you convince yourself that's a healthy change. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it's something very different. I call this sign strategic replacement. When an avoidant has emotionally finished with a relationship, they rarely spend much time sitting with the pain. Facing those emotions requires vulnerability, self-reflection, and emotional processing. Things that often feel deeply uncomfortable for someone with an avoidant attachment style. Instead of sitting with the loss, they often begin filling every empty space. Suddenly, they're immersed in new hobbies, spending more time with different people, creating fresh routines, making exciting plans, and building a lifestyle that no longer naturally includes you. You notice they're constantly busy. They're going out more often, sharing moments on social media, and presenting a version of themselves that feels completely disconnected from the relationship you've been trying so hard to save. The hardest part isn't simply that they're doing these things, it's that they seem perfectly okay. While you've been living with uncertainty, replaying conversations, searching for answers, and investing everything you have into repairing the relationship, they appear to be moving through life without carrying the same emotional weight. That contrast hurts in a way that's difficult to explain. Because someone who is avoidant but still wants the relationship usually doesn't become completely untouched by the distance. Even while pulling away, they still carry some internal conflict. They may not express it openly or process it the same way you would, but the relationship still occupies emotional space within them. There is still something beneath the surface. Even if they never put it into words, you can often sense the emotional weight they carry. You can feel that something inside them knows the relationship isn't okay. They may avoid talking about it, but the tension hasn't disappeared. The situation changes completely when an avoidant has emotionally let go. That inner conflict fades. Instead of carrying emotional heaviness, they often seem lighter, more energized, and surprisingly at peace. From the outside, it may look as though a burden has been lifted from their shoulders. The difficult truth is that the burden they no longer feel is the relationship itself. This is where strategic replacement becomes so important to recognize. Rather than facing the emptiness that follows emotional disconnection, they begin filling that space with other things: new routines, new interests, new friendships, new distractions. Whether they're fully aware of it or not, these become ways of avoiding the uncomfortable emotions they've spent much of their lives trying to escape. For someone with a deeply avoidant pattern, sitting alone with emotional emptiness can feel overwhelming. So instead of processing the loss, they replace it. Pay close attention to where their energy is consistently flowing. If, over an extended period of time, not just for a stressful week or two, you notice that their emotional investment keeps moving farther away from you and toward an entirely separate life, don't dismiss it as simple independence or a need for personal space. Ask yourself whether the effort that once went into nurturing your relationship is now being invested somewhere else. Then notice something even more revealing. When you're together, do they actually feel present? Or does it seem like they're simply going through the motions? Are they physically sitting beside you while emotionally feeling miles away? That detached feeling is incredibly painful because it creates the illusion of togetherness without genuine connection. You're sharing the same space, yet it feels as though the person you fell in love with has quietly disappeared. You keep reaching for the version of them you remember, only to find someone who looks familiar but feels emotionally distant. When that checked-out presence combines with the pattern of building a life that no longer includes you, it's often a strong indication that they've already moved on emotionally, even if they haven't officially ended the relationship. Now let's look at the third and perhaps most revealing sign. This is the one people overlook most often because, on the surface, it doesn't seem alarming. It can easily be mistaken for patience, respect, or simply giving someone room to breathe. I call it the death of curiosity. Think back to the beginning of your relationship. Remember how interested they were in discovering who you really were? They didn't just ask about your day. They wanted to understand your thoughts, your fears, your dreams, your childhood, your goals, the things that inspired you, the things that hurt you, and the person you hoped to become. Being the focus of someone's genuine curiosity creates an incredibly powerful feeling. Few experiences are more meaningful than feeling truly seen, deeply understood, and sincerely valued for who you are beneath the surface. Even if that stage didn't last forever, it felt authentic while it existed. Now ask yourself something different. When was the last time they asked you a question that truly mattered? Not something routine like how work went or what you wanted to eat. Think about the last time they asked something that showed they had been thinking about you when you weren't together. The last time they wanted to understand what was happening inside your heart or mind. The last time they made you feel like there were still parts of you they genuinely wanted to discover. If you have to struggle to remember, that alone says a great deal. Because genuine love doesn't stop being curious. Real emotional investment continues asking questions long after the excitement of the honeymoon stage fades. Even through disagreements, ordinary routines, and everyday life, people who remain emotionally invested keep wanting to know the person they're with on a deeper level. An avoidant who still wants you in their life often shows that curiosity in subtle ways. Even if they struggle to express affection directly or admit how vulnerable they feel, they'll still remember something you mentioned days ago. They'll ask how an important meeting went. They'll bring up a conversation you almost forgot you had. They'll wonder what you think about something they know matters to you. Those moments may seem small, but they reveal something significant. They show that you're still living in their thoughts. When someone has emotionally checked out, that curiosity quietly disappears. Your conversations become practical, predictable, and emotionally shallow. Everything revolves around schedules, responsibilities, or surface-level topics. The deeper questions vanish, not because they're carefully respecting your boundaries, but because they no longer feel driven to understand you. That creates a very specific kind of loneliness. You can be sitting beside someone and still feel completely unseen. You might share something deeply personal, only to receive a response so brief or emotionally disconnected that it leaves you feeling even more alone than silence would have. It's as though they're responding to a version of you they've stopped paying attention to. Over time, this can become emotionally damaging. You begin questioning yourself instead of questioning the relationship. You wonder if you've become boring. You wonder whether you've changed. You wonder if you're somehow no longer enough. So you work even harder. You try to become more interesting. You create special experiences. You search for ways to recreate the closeness that once came naturally. But the issue was never your ability to hold their attention. The issue is that they've stopped looking. The death of curiosity rarely arrives all at once. It fades quietly, almost invisibly. But once you recognize it for what it is, it's very difficult to ignore. Now step back and look at the bigger picture. First, the repair disappears. Every effort to reconnect comes from you, while they make no attempt to close the emotional distance after conflict. Second, their energy consistently moves somewhere else. They're building a life that feels increasingly separate from yours, and even when you're together, they seem emotionally absent. Third, genuine curiosity fades away. Conversations lose their depth, meaningful questions disappear, and you begin feeling invisible despite being right beside them. If these three patterns have become consistent rather than occasional, if they've become your new reality instead of temporary phases, you're likely not dealing with someone who simply needs space or is temporarily overwhelmed. You're looking at someone who has already left emotionally. And this is where many people make the biggest mistake. Once they begin recognizing these signs, their natural instinct is to try even harder. They give more, love more, sacrifice more, hoping that enough effort will bring the relationship back to life. That reaction is completely understandable. When someone you deeply love starts drifting away, every instinct tells you to reach out, hold on tighter, and fight with everything you have to keep them from slipping away. But here's what usually happens when you try harder. If an avoidant has already emotionally checked out, increasing your effort rarely brings them back. Instead, it often pushes them further away. Their fear of feeling trapped causes them to build even stronger walls, leaving you feeling like the more you love, the more distant they become. Over time, you may begin believing one of the most painful lies anyone can tell themselves, that somehow you weren't enough. That if you had loved harder, been more patient, asked for less, or become easier to be with, things would have turned out differently. But that isn't the truth. The truth is that you were giving your love to someone who was no longer emotionally available to receive it. You weren't failing because your love lacked value. You were simply offering it to a person who had already started closing the door emotionally. No amount of love can reach someone who has stopped allowing themselves to receive it. So, where do you go from here? The first step is to stop making yourself smaller. When you're with someone who keeps pulling away, you slowly begin changing yourself without even realizing it. You stop bringing up difficult conversations because you're afraid they'll create more distance. You stop asking for reassurance because you don't want to seem needy. You become overly careful with your words, your emotions, and your expectations, constantly trying to avoid triggering another withdrawal. Little by little, your emotional world becomes smaller and smaller. Before you know it, you're no longer showing up as your authentic self. You're showing up as the version of yourself you hope will finally feel safe enough for them to stay. But healthy love should never require you to disappear in order to keep someone comfortable. A relationship should be built by two people carrying the emotional weight together. When one person is doing all the adjusting, all the waiting, and all the emotional work, that isn't partnership anymore. It's survival. The second step is to stop negotiating with silence. When someone is emotionally pulling away, it's natural to hold on to every tiny moment that gives you hope. Maybe they send a slightly warmer text. Maybe they laugh with you like they used to. Maybe you have one good evening together, and suddenly it feels like everything is finally getting back on track. Those moments feel incredibly meaningful because your heart desperately wants them to be proof that the relationship is healing. But ask yourself an honest question. Do those moments lead to lasting change, or do they always fade back into distance, inconsistency, and emotional absence? If the overall pattern never changes, don't let isolated moments convince you that everything is different. Sometimes silence says more than words ever could. Finally, choose clarity even when it hurts. The truth can be painful, but it also brings freedom. Once you stop chasing the relationship you wish you had and begin accepting the relationship that's actually in front of you, your energy begins to return. You stop exhausting yourself trying to solve a problem that only the other person has the power to fix. Yes, you'll grieve. You'll grieve the future you imagined, the connection you hoped for, and the person you believed they could become. But grief is part of healing, not a reason to stay trapped. Remember this: avoidant attachment doesn't change because someone is loved enough. Real change only happens when the person is willing to face their fears, take responsibility for their patterns, and do the difficult work of healing. That journey belongs to them. You cannot carry it for them, and you cannot love them into becoming someone they're not ready to be. If repair has disappeared, if their emotional energy is consistently invested elsewhere, and if their curiosity about you has quietly faded, don't ignore those patterns. Believe what they're showing you instead of holding on to what you hope will happen. Most importantly, choose yourself. You deserve a relationship where someone wants to know your heart, values repairing conflict, and continues choosing you day after day. You sensed something was wrong long before you could explain it. Now you understand why. Trust your instincts, trust the patterns you've seen, and let that clarity become the beginning of a new chapter, one where your love is finally returned instead of constantly chased.